Hi again. In Jonathan Butler's discussion of Adventism and the American Experience, which is the last chapter of The Rise of Adventism, edited by Edwin Gaustad, on page 187, Butler has been discussing the Seventh-day Adventist response to the Civil War. He goes on, quite consistently, the radical republicanism of Adventists remained a paper radicalism that evoked more verbiage than action. Political participation in the Republic seemed futile. Thus, before the 1856 election, Uriah Smith published an editorial on politics, declaring Adventists neutral. In an election year, when issues such as slavery were more clear-cut than they would be in 1860, Smith said that Adventists had basic sympathies. They were for temperance and against intemperance, for Protestantism and against Catholicism, for freedom and not slavery, for republicanism and not tyranny. But despite their sympathies, they would not vote. The American two-horned beast would be a dragon at heart ultimately, no matter how Adventists voted, and they refused to hasten or retard the fulfillment of this prophecy. Aside from James White, J.N. Andrews, and others insisting that Adventists vote whenever temperance became an issue, most probably agreed with Smith's directive. The Adventists who cast ballots in the 1860 election voted for Lincoln, but their political activity extended to little else than voting. They adhered to a prophetic determinism that would neutralize any political effort of their own and leave the great juggernaut of political history in God's firm hand. Uriah Smith's editorial policy regarding slavery provoked some criticism. Anson Byington, the eldest brother of John, wrote to Smith in 1859 that he was discontinuing the Review and Herald as soon as his $3 subscription expired. He felt in the last 2 or 3 years the journal had wavered from its earlier abolitionist position, and due to the denominational equivocation on slavery, Anson could not identify himself with the Seventh-day Adventists. Adventists were paralyzed, he argued, by the prophecy of Revelation 13, that bondsmen and bondswomen would be found on earth at Christ's coming, and therefore were doing nothing about slavery. I dare not tell the slave, he wrote, that he can afford to be contented in his bondage until the Savior comes, however near we may believe his coming. Surely the editor of the Review could not afford to go without his breakfast till then. End of quote. Smith took issue with Byington. He said the Review and Herald always had been and would continue to be abolitionist. Furthermore, Smith encouraged runaway slaves rather than insisting slaves be content with their lot. But he would not give slaves false hope, for their only hope was the Messiah. Like most Adventists at this time, Smith believed that slavery would last until Christ freed the slaves at his coming, and Smith hoped, drolly, that Christ would come before Byington's subscription ran out. The question of a national draft into the armed forces aggravated discussion over just how disengaged Adventists could be from the American beast. Seventh-day Adventists bore the stigma of Copperheadism, despite their outspokenly abolitionist and radical Republican publications, for their failure to participate in Civil War combat. In an effort to explain this paradox and shed the impression of disloyalty, James White wrote his editorial on The Nation. Specifically, he meant his editorial to counterbalance in the public mind some vociferously pacifistic Iowa Adventists whom he and his wife had recently visited. White wrote that there were 2 reasons Adventists, though abolitionists and pro-union, could not participate in the war. First, because America would remain a dragon, as Uriah Smith had said, and slavery would not be abolished until the Second Advent, no matter how the war went. And second, because 2 commandments were violated in any war. The 4th commandment, for keeping the 7th-day Sabbath, would be impossible in the army, and the 6th commandment, against killing. White went on to say, and here he ignited opposition, that should a draft force Adventists into the army, it would be madness to resist. In fact, Adventists should be the last people to sneak off to Canada. Actually, White implied that God would probably prevent Adventists from being inducted into the Army, but if they should be drafted, the government and not individual Adventists would be responsible for the broken commandments. Controversy raged in the Review and Herald from August until the end of October. Many Adventists were confused or troubled by the Nation editorial. R.F. Cottrell, a prominent Adventist who became a spokesman for the non-resistors or pacifists, warned White that his editorial would lead Adventists to volunteer, as happened in at least one case. The non-resistors among the Iowa Adventists charged White with condoning Sabbath breaking and murder. J.M. Waggoner, an Adventist leader of Burlington, Michigan, took a pacifist position and also spurned the idea of buying commutation for $300, for it discriminated against the poor. G.I. Butler, a future General Conference president, estimated that, quote, the mass of our people leaned toward non-resistance, unquote. But nevertheless, there were those, however few, who approved of participation in the war. Joseph Clark held an extremely militarist position in two review articles entitled The War, and The Sword versus Fanaticism. He proposed that a Sabbath-keeping regiment be formed to strike this rebellion a staggering blow. Less intemperate pro-war positions were held by J.N. Lowborough, D.T. Bordeaux, and others. James White truncated debate in a restatement of his own view, which actually involved some modification of the first editorial. He rejected as extremes both unconditional non-resistance and unqualified support of the war. But his summation was that, quote, we cannot see how God can be glorified by his loyal people taking up arms, end of quote. Ellen White ensured that debate would not be reopened by adding her own prophetic word, while reaffirming her unequivocal opposition to both slavery and the Southern Rebellion, as she called it. She wrote, quote, I was shown that God's people, who are his peculiar treasure, cannot engage in this perplexing war, for it is opposed to every principle of their faith, end of quote. Participation in the conflict would involve, again quoting, a continual violation of conscience, end of quote. However, she criticized non-resistors who impetuously declared that they would suffer imprisonment or death rather than submit to the draft. Adventists should affirm their loyalty to the government as well as to God. The Iowa pacifists, feeling betrayed by the James White editorial, had at once joined Quakers in petitioning the Iowa legislature for pacifist status. Ellen White reprimanded the non-resistors in her testimony. She wrote, quote, instead of making their petitions to the God of heaven and relying solely upon his power, they petitioned the legislature and were refused. They showed their weakness and exposed their lack of faith, end of quote. Her husband expressed similar sentiments on pacifist petitions as he had done earlier in the issue of Sunday legislation when Seventh-day Baptists petitioned Congress. He did not believe in taking legal action to protect observance of either the fourth or sixth commandment. Again, God had determined events for the Adventists of this hour, and they remained only spectators in the procession of history. Toward the end of the war, circumstances drove Adventists to appeal to the government, uncharacteristically, on both a state and a federal level, as the draft law of July 4, 1864, discontinued the privilege of commutation and made it necessary for Adventists to establish themselves as a peace church. A forthcoming document entitled The Draft concealed the differing opinions on the war issue and declared Adventists unanimously non-combatant. Rather than wage war, the primary concern of Seventh-day Adventists, even at the height of Civil War conflict, was preaching the gospel. Ministers wrote the Review and Herald complaining that excitement over the war was upsetting their meetings. Often they had to roll up their tents temporarily due to enlistment activity or rallies or other military disturbances. As the war hung on, Adventists longed for the day normalcy would be restored, something Adventists had not dreamed possible formerly, so they could be about their Father's business. Even Joseph Bates, a longtime anti-slavery man, used election days to preach the gospel. Thus, a sketch of Seventh-day Adventists in the Vale of Tears for Millerism through the Civil War shows them direly pessimistic about the Republic. Adventists resisted full legal incorporation, limited political involvement to voting sporadically, and generally avoided military combat, either by purchasing commutation or registering as non-combatants, because America was a dragon that neither deserved nor could benefit by their support. Adventist radical republicanism did not represent an investment in the political process, as it did for Thaddeus Stevens or Charles Sumner, but a rhetoric of utter disenchantment with contemporary politics. It was only in this limited and qualified sense that Adventists at this time could be called political. Put in a link to The Minds Who Made Jehovah's Witnesses and the playlist that is part of, the first video from that playlist, The Minds That Made Jehovah's Witnesses. The whole series playlist is called JW Roots.